The first talk in line is Life Writing in Cultural Memory, Basharat Curfewed Night, a frontline memoir of life, war in Kashmir. Dr. Waterman is a member of research teams of CRHIA, Center of Research in International and Atlantic History, and D2IA, Asian Dynamics, Interaction and Interculturality. He's also director of the doctoral program Euclid and director of Asia Pacific Institute. Dr. Waterman works on Pakistani history, culture, and literature in English. His most recent book-length publications are Where Words Collide, Pakistani Fiction in the New Millennium, and History, Memory, Fiction, New Dimensions in Contemporary Pakistani and Kashmiri Writing, forthcoming in early 2022, both with the Oxford University Press. Audience, I present you Professor Dr. David Waterman.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to make sure that you're hearing me okay. The technology is working the way it should. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. But first of all, I need to thank everybody for your kind invitation to IUB. And as you know, well, I mean, I'm looking at a room full of people who are not just colleagues, but friends as well. And so you know, as well as I do, that IUB and the English department at IUB is sort of our home away from home in Pakistan. And we deeply regret not being able to travel there this year because of COVID, but hopefully we can catch up with everybody in person next year. So thank you once again for your kind invitation. Worthy Vice Chancellor, thank you for your comments. And indeed, we will get that MOU signed very, very soon as I can tackle our Vice President here in La Rochelle. And of course, Dr. Jajad, for your wonderful introduction, which is, as usual, a bit over the top, making me sound like Superman when I'm really not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Kashmir today, because if we're talking about geocriticism, Kashmir sort of lends itself to a geocritical approach to literature, given its, well, it's not just its geographic location, but the fact that it is contested space, right? And so it's very politically charged as well. I'd seen Sohail earlier. I don't see him now, but Sohail and I have had conversations in the past about, oh, there he is. He's moving on camera. We've had conversations in the past about my interest in Kashmir as a project. And while that did not become a complete project in and of itself, the forthcoming book that Raheen announced, Kashmir figures very largely in about half of that book. And so that project did come to fruition, even though it was not a completely Kashmiri project. So here we go. Good to see you all again. I start with just a little quotation from Rashid Naski that says, "How far is the world from here?" Kashmir, that fabled paradise on earth, is regularly in the news, but for the wrong reasons. Most often mentioned as the point of friction between two nuclear-armed neighbors in South Asia.
Are you sitting?
Apart from some occasional noise by the United Nations and the international community, calling for plebiscites, restraint, and bilateral negotiations, the violence in Kashmir makes the headlines from time to time, then is largely forgotten by those who don't live there. Basharat Pir was born and raised there, and his memoir of life in Kashmir in the 1980s and 1990s, the memoir was published in 2010, combines good journalism with personal experience, the kind of life writing that highlights not only the details of the everyday, but orients the reader morally and politically. Life writing is not restricted to the genre of biography, autobiography, or memoir, but can easily include fictional works as well. And as we will see, even a memoir does not rely solely on the author's memory, but includes other sources, documents, histories, myths and traditions, and so on. As such, the generic boundaries between fiction, memory, and fact are already permeable and should remain that way in order to encourage what Max Saunders calls routes into cultural memory. Saunders goes on to say that cultural memory is, quote, concerned not with actual events, but with their cultural repercussions, not with actual memories, but with memories as representations or mediations or narrativizations of the event they have always begun to turn the event into something else. That something else means something more than archival history, more than recollection of past events, more than individual memories, with the goal of writing the self and the collectivity, recording marginalized voices, insisting that things could be otherwise, and as we will see, sometimes therapy for the author and his or her community as well. Such therapeutic life writing and production of cultural memory become necessary in any society which is, quote from the memoir, far too intimate with violence. Curfewed Night is not simply an individual memoir, but that of an entire generation. Its specific historical situation, its collective cultural memories, a representation of the past and its repercussions with a view toward the future. Curfewed Night is a memoir of both lived experience in the 1980s and 90s and a retrospective/introspective return years later. Although we can and do consider cultural memory in a broad sense across a given community, such sentiments are often at their strongest within one generation. In this case, the generation of young men who were physically present at the time, those who grew up amidst the militants and the soldiers, many becoming militants themselves. Jürgen Reulecke calls this phenomenon generationality, saying, quote, generation and generationality are, in the end, not tangible entities, but rather mental, often very zeitgeist-dependent constructs through which people, as members of a specific age group, are located or locate themselves historically, and accordingly create a we feeling. In Pierre's memoir, such a feeling of historical location is illustrated by a comment such as, "The war of my adolescence had started," or a question that is more than a question. This is a quote from the memoir. "Are you a Kashmiri?" a wiry man with disheveled curly hair and a beak-like nose asked. I smiled back. Both his nose and his question were very Kashmiri. The question asked in Kashmiri was a greeting, a question one Kashmiri asks another Kashmiri in any situation, in any corner of the world, the moment he realizes his companion is from Kashmir. I have answered and asked this question. It comes with an informal smile and more questions aimed at placing you in Kashmir. Although physical space and linear time are essential elements within a generational context, people who find themselves in the same geographical place at the same time, in this case, Indian-occupied Kashmir in the 80s and 90s, it takes more than that to go beyond what Karl Mannheim called generational location to generational connection and ultimately to generational consciousness. Issues of socioeconomic class within a given generation should be considered, for example. Those who have the financial means to simply leave Kashmir have more options open to them. But more strikingly in Curfewed Night is the question of gender, which comes to the fore. This memoir of war in Kashmir is generally focused on young men, many of whom shared the experience of prison and torture. But there were also young women who composed roughly half of this generation, yet it is safe to say that a memoir written in this context by a woman would undoubtedly locate itself differently. Time, too, is not the linear time of clocks, but rather the lived time, the durée, that Henri Bergson and others elucidate. Pierre himself understands la durée. This is a quote. I looked at my watch again and turned toward the door. It stood still, wooden. I sat down on the floor and stared at the door. I was somewhat numb. The anticipation of interrogation is worse than the interrogation. Citing Bergson, David Middleton and Stephen D. Brown tell us, in this regard, life must be characterized by the uncertainty found in this small example of being made to wait. This generation of Kashmiris, these people who grew up during the war, have shared events during their formative years, and further, continue to share the consequences of those events in the form of a collective consciousness, or what Maurice Halbwachs has called a spiritual reality. Even when discussing individual memories, as presented in a memoir, the broader social context is essential to the foundation of cultural memory, as Royalty suggests. This is a quote. Studying historical contexts with the generational approach connects the identification of general structures and processes, especially those of various social levels, with the subjective perceptions and experiences of contemporaries, including their interpretations, spheres of action, and options for action. With such an approach, the individual is left his unmistakable historicity within the framework of this realm of experience, as well as his life story, with a view not least toward his actions in light of the future open to him. As we will see later, life writing, such as Curfewed Night, is not simply concerned with the past, but the present and future as well, already anticipated when Peer tells the reader, "Time and again, I look back and try to cull from memory the moment that was to change everything I had been and would be." In January 1990, protesters took to the streets as a response to Indian aggression, and Peer recalls the moment when he first became part of something bigger, the collective conscience, the aforementioned spiritual reality. From the memoir, "I felt anger spread in me. Amidst the collision of bodies, the holding of hands, the interlocking of eyes in affirmation and confirmation, the merging of 1,000 voices, I had ceased to be a shy, bookish boy, hunched by the expectations of my family. I wasn't scared of being scolded anymore. I felt a part of something much bigger. I let myself go with the crowd. Azadi." This merging of 1,000 voices should be taken literally in terms of social or cultural memory. Marcel and Muccielli, referring to Halbwachs' Les Cadres sociaux de la mémoire, suggest that collective memorial landmarks become structures of support for other memories, facilitating group membership by, quote, locating memories using social frames built from our present identity. For his point is that the past is not really preserved in the individual memory. Fragments persist there, but not complete recollections. What makes them true memories are collective representations. We've been discussing generationality as a building block of cultural memory, yet it also becomes clear that the generational connection or consciousness established by one generation, those growing up in Indian-occupied Kashmir in our example, can be passed along to successive generations as well. As we have said, it often becomes the task of the following generation to tell the stories that were blocked by first generation aphasia, especially when dealing with traumatic experiences, right? Whether individual or collective, as Rulicki explains. A citation. A given generation's formative experiences can, it is true, not be passed on directly, but they do indeed flow in the form of memory contents created through later selection, attribution, interpretation, etc., into the generative succession as well as into the subjective positioning in one's own temporal heimat, one's own homeland. They can also be a legacy intentionally offered to posterity in the form of narratives, bequeathed works, institutions, designed places, and more. And also, according to Freud, engraved in subsequent generations, even without an expressed intention to pass them on, although these later generations might also, consciously or unconsciously, reject, reinterpret, or erase them. End of quote. Peer's memoir falls clearly into the category of a legacy intentionally offered to posterity, a realistic record of the human suffering in Indian-occupied Kashmir, an effort to challenge the seeming indifference of those actors who have the power to change the situation. While the first generation can be a motive force for moral and ethical guidance and ultimately political change, as we will see later, it is the durability of cultural memory and cultural trauma as part of that memory over time, which can also inform and influence possible futures that are open to a community. If indeed a generation possesses and projects a certain representation of itself, as we have said, it is through a blending of factual history, memory, and fiction. Generic boundaries are less rigid in what has been called faction or nonfiction novels, which would include, at least to a degree, much Pakistani Anglophone fiction as representative of historical fiction. And I would suggest that such generic permeability works the other way around, too, with memoir as a similarly permeable genre. Birgit Neumann and others call such works fictions of memory, which both depict the workings of memory and refer to, quote, the stories that individuals or cultures tell about their past to answer the question, who am I? Or, collectively, who are we? More often than not, they turn out to be an imaginative reconstruction of the past in response to current needs, consisting of predispositions, biases, and values, which provide agreed upon codes for understanding the past and present. Curfewed Night is a memoir, and as such, a necessarily hybrid creature, which, thanks to a certain flexibility, becomes a representation of cultural memory, a cultural document in its own right, and perhaps an archival document in historical terms, which purports to record what really happened. Cultural memory is a vast gray zone consisting of memories, constructions, influences, facts, contradictions and beliefs, a mix of the imaginary and the real, and new perspectives as the process of cultural memory follows its winding, evolving course. The creation of meaning is a primary objective, what Neumann calls identity creating constructions of a usable past. When discussing Curfewed Night, such a usable past resonates politically as a call for change in the future, as a moral and ethical appeal to insist that things could be other than the way they are. If social change is the goal, the question comes up, what kinds of possible futures are open to us? Although the question might seem a bit wrong-headed, especially if we take seriously Willem Flusser's remark that we always and everywhere occupy the present. While the discourse of progress would have us believe that time approaches us from the past and heads towards the future, for Flusser it is clear that, quote, the future advances toward us in our here and now from all directions. In any case, the importance of the present is undeniable and goes a step further to justify what we have said before, that much of memoir and cultural memory is more concerned with present issues in its retrospection/introspection of past history and experience as it seeks to construct meaning. A slightly different question then arises. What kinds of futures do we wish to structure from our contemporary present past? In other words, not simply answering those questions of identity we'd asked earlier, who am I, who are we, but also, where do we want to go from here? Where can we go from here? Or, keeping Flusser in mind, perhaps the question should be, what kinds of present past do we want to create in order to favor certain outcomes when the future comes our way, to avoid becoming what Peir's poet teacher called the non-beings of the world? Middleton and Brown suggest that the key to linking past and future is, quote, to focus on imaginary futures in the past. Experience matters not so much in terms of what happened in the past, but in terms of how we build the past with the future in ways that make for the possibility of becoming different. In other words, how we actualize alternative trajectories of living. Much like the example provided by Pierre's father in the memoir when speaking of Nehru and Gandhi and Havel. Quote from the memoir: "None of them used guns, but they changed history. If you want to do something for Kashmir, I would say you should read." Neumann links this concept directly to literary representations. Quote from Neumann: "Characteristically, fictions of memory are presented by a reminiscing narrator or figure who looks back on his or her past, trying to impose meaning on the surfacing memories from a present point of view. Events that took place in the past are recollected only later, i.e., in the present, and are represented as the memories experienced by a narrator or a figure. The constitutive characteristic of all fictions of memory is therefore their operating with co-present time perspectives. This multi-temporal levels of the past and the present intermingle in manifold and complex ways. This kind of organization does not merely establish a consecutive order, not merely a chain of elements along the arrow of time, but a reference frame in which each event is related to others in both a forward and backward direction. Each event is both marked by all preceding events and evokes expectations about events to come. When looked at this way, we're better able to highlight the political aspect of such representations of cultural memory. World creation, ideas of self and collectivity, sanctioned and unsanctioned memories, pluralities of worldviews, moral and ethical orientation, all with the goal of communicating this generation's experience to others and instigating social change. What Neumann calls, quote, a laboratory in which we can experiment with the possibilities for culturally admissible constructions of the past. In our discussion of Curfewed Night, a culturally admissible construction of the past would not refer to censorship by this or that institution regarding how history is to be officially represented, but rather a past which anchors cultural memory, including its traumas, in all of its facts, fictions, and memories, with a focus on its repercussions in the present as the future arrives from all directions. Now, in a narrative of progress, there would be a teleological "and they all lived happily ever after" ending to the story. But Pierre knows that it is not to be when he tells the reader, quote, "The journey was not over. It will never be. The conflict might leave the streets, but it will not leave the soul," suggesting that Kashmir and Kashmiris are indeed stuck in a present past that will not pass. Like a traumatic memory that continues to haunt, the line of control becomes the concrete symbol of, quote, "that failure of the subconscious." And it ran through our grief, our anger, our tears, and our silence. Yet for all of the scars, physical and psychological, Pierre's memoir is preparing the ground for a better future, hoping, quote, "that someday the war they were fighting and the reasons for its existence would disappear like footsteps on winter snow." There was no fear that evening. There were only hands reaching out of the bus windows, waving in the air as if each wave would erase the lines of control. An imaginary future, perhaps, but possible futures are imagined in the way the past is represented to our generation and to those that follow, in the hope of representing history in a way that such a morally and ethically oriented historiography might allow the future to become something else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waterman. That was quite inclusive and very interesting. I just had a question of my own that Like Basharat says that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. It's one of the lines in all that I really like. So I was just wondering that previously, this medium or what we call really that the cultural studies, or we call it the crisis studies in a way, or the war trauma and stuff like that, collective memory and all these things were not part of academia, and let alone being part of literature, and the books were not written about it. It's something quite new to particularly Pakistani writing. So what do you really think that it would make an impact, though slow, in the political front of introducing into the discipline of academia?
Do I think it would make a difference to introduce these kinds of theoretical lenses? Is that do I understand the question properly?
Because here it's not part of the academia really.
Yeah, see, that's as well. Those of you who know my work a little bit, you know that I very often examine literature, not only literature but press and things too, but that my approach to literature is not terribly literary. I tend to apply more social critical and social psychological sorts of approaches. You may know that I do have a diploma in psychology as well, with a strong interest in social psychology. And so my own feeling, and it has been this way ever since I did my training back in the 1990s, is that these kinds of social critique and ways of looking at traumatic memories, which call for almost a psychoanalytic vocabulary, really, in some ways. I honestly do think that would be useful, because for me, the only literature that interests me is literature which has something to say about our real world, and is working to make our world a better place in one way or another. And I suppose that's political at least in a broad sense, not in party politics ways. But personally, I think that, not everybody agrees with me. I mean, even in France, my work has been critiqued as not being literary enough, since I'm examining literature. But I honestly think that some of these more politically oriented lenses through which to examine literature are good ways of bringing literature kind of out of the aesthetic margins, if you will, and saying, look, these are not just nice books to read and pretty stories, but they have something to say that's very important about the real world, and we should pay attention to them in that capacity. Yes.
Waterman, I have one question. Can you hear me, Waterman?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can see you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, I mean, it seems very fine and nice that we kind of have this freedom to revisit our past and revise it, improvise it, and recreate it the way we want this to be. But then, how and when shall we learn from our mistakes if we keep on revising and rewriting and reconstructing the past? Would this not lead to some kind of self-deception and something like that?
Well, I think I understand your point, and I think that's a very good point. When we look at the past is what really happened. But of course, we don't have a record. We never have a complete record of the past. What we have is history, which is always a partial and incomplete record. And when I talk about looking at our past and recreating it, there are of course many ways to do that. I mean, certain totalitarian regimes, or not even necessarily totalitarian, this happens all the time. We're always rewriting history. But some regimes would go even further, rewriting history to only include things that are approved. If you have not yet read Snuffing Out the Moon, that work talks about that quite a bit as well. And so I'm not really talking about necessarily those kinds of what I would call dishonest attempts to revise the historical archive and bits of the past, but it's actually making conscious choices Let me just give you one example from some of the reading I've done. Here in Europe, for a long, long time in the past, Europeans basically looked to the Greco-Roman tradition as their cultural, historical past, right? But then at some point, about 2,000 years ago, this prophet named Jesus Christ came along, right? And he brought Christianity to a region not too far from Europe. And of course, Christianity then moved into Europe. And all of a sudden, many of those Europeans chose, instead of to focus on their past as being Greco-Roman past, they chose to align their past, their ancestry, if you will, with this new movement that was called Christianity. Okay, and see, that's the kind of example I'm talking about when I talk about using our past in perhaps constructive ways, you know, and of course, um, where we have to decide how, because the past that we choose to focus on and that we choose to construct is going to limit us in our future choices, especially when we understand that our reconstructions of the past are almost always done according to our present needs. If you look at history of the United States, you know, they tend to not emphasize very much the Indian genocide, for example, in the foundation of that country, or the blacks who were imported as slaves. You know, they very much prefer to try and create a different past. And in the recent elections in the United States, you saw that there are certain white supremacist groups who are trying to create a different version of history, which is obviously not terribly constructive. And so I guess that's the kind of thing that I mean to focus on when I talk about how we want to sort of construct our past. And oftentimes those constructions of the past, we have to, once again, in almost psychoanalytic terms, we have to avoid the temptation to just sweep the bad bits, you know, the traumatic bits and the embarrassing bits under the rug, because, as you know, those will come back to haunt us someday. And it is better to work through those problems and confront them than to try and repress them, because, as you know, things that are repressed have a way of coming back to haunting us later. And so I think as long as there's a bit of honesty in the process, it can work well.
Thank you. Any